Welcome to God and Man. I'm your host, Sam, and so glad you can join me for today's episode. Now, this is going to be a pretty big, hot button topic for a lot of people, and that's going to be immigration. Now, what I want to present in this episode is a Christian perspective on why we could be against a significant amount of immigration. I've heard a lot of Christians in support of immigration, that we want to love foreigners, but I want us to be a little bit more inquisitive, thoughtful, ethical about how we engage with this question, and to answer it more robustly is my hopes. Now, I think there's two particular keystones for this argument, for this discussion on this topic, and that is love of the foreigner, the sojourner, the stranger, whatever word you want to use, and love of your neighbor. So those are both Christian convictions, and I think they're right at the heart of this question. So how are we going to go about answering it, right? So it's a complex ethical question, and we're not going to get straightforward answers from the Bible, but what we're going to need to do is take principles that we find and apply those fundamental theological principles and get some conclusions from them. Now, one of those principles that we have is what does it mean to love others? And the other one that I think is a bit less obvious, but is who is responsible to love who? So what does it look like to love? What does it mean to love others? And then who is responsible to love who? Those are the two questions we really want to look at. And then we're going to see what conclusions we can draw from them as we answer them from the Bible. So, to begin with, let's start with what does it look like to love others? Now, in particular, we want to think about what does the Bible actually command us to do when we're told to love others? Is it commanding us to provide people with everything that they want, everything they need? Well, there's one passage here for us I've got, and I just love how it describes love. It's really helpful. So it's 1 John 4, and it presents God's love, and it shows us what it means. It shows us that love, our love, is to be like God's. So let's read it from verse 7. This is what it says: Beloved, let us love one another, for love is from God. Whoever loves has been born of God and knows God. Anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. In this, the love of God has been manifest among us, that God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him. So first thing to point out, God's love brings about action. God sent his Son into the world because of his love. And what does sending his Son into the world aim to achieve? Well, it's so that we might live through him. So God's love brings about action to bring about our life, a restored relationship with God. It brings us back into life with God. That is the objective of God's love toward us. And we see this again in verse 11. In this is love. Not that we loved God, but he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins. Beloved, if God so loved us, we ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God. If we love one another, God abides in us and his love is perfected in us. In God's love, he sends Jesus into the world and to be the propitiation for sins. Propitiation just means appeasing God's wrath, the satisfying of God's justice and judgment against sin. So God's love sends Jesus in the world to get rid of God's wrath against us and to bring us into relationship with God. That's what God's love's all about, and our love is to be like that. So our love is to be sacrificial like God's love. It cost the life of his own Son. But importantly, John speaks of love between believers. However, there is a key principle here that the nature of God's love toward us, that is, he first loved us and not the other way around. In that there was nothing lovable about us that made God love us. He first showed love toward us and loved us, which brought us into a relationship with him. And so as Christians, having a love that is like God's means that we don't just love people who love us back. We love people and they might love us back, but it's not an expectation. So our love is like God's love toward us. It's sacrificial, it's directed towards a restored relationship with God, and it acts towards those who are yet to love in response. So what does it look like to love exactly? Well, I think a good passage here is in James. So James chapter 2, verse 15 says, "If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacks in daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, be warm and filled,' without giving them the things they needed for the body, what good is that?" So it would seem that love does mean providing for some physical needs. But interestingly, again, here in James, he speaks of loving your brother, right? Loving other Christians. So if you don't help them, then he says your faith is useless. It says that because of your actions, you show that you don't have love for God in you. You don't have faith. But this does help us show that part of what it means to love with God's love is to provide for someone's need. Ultimately, God provides for our spiritual need in providing the sacrifice of his Son so that we could have eternal life. And so likewise, our love towards people needs to demonstrate God's love of provision for our needs. That might be in genuine physical needs, but for some people it may be sharing the gospel, encouraging in the faith, so that they have a restored relationship with God. But what we do see in James is it does, and at times really does, involve providing for people's physical needs. But the question then is, does this love extend towards people outside of the Christian community? Because both in 1 John and James, he's talking to Christians about loving other Christians. So does this extend beyond the Christian? Does this extend beyond the Christian community? So does this love extend to neighbours and foreigners? Lucky for us, someone does ask that question to Jesus. Someone asks, "Who is my neighbour?" to Jesus. In Luke 10:25, this is what it says. "And behold, a lawyer stood up to put him to the test," that is, put Jesus to the test, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" He said to him, "What is written in the law? How do you read it?" And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbour as yourself." And he said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." But he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, "Who is my neighbour?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down to Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among robbers who stripped him and beat him and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he journeyed, came to where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. He went to him and bound up his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he sent him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, 'Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, I'll repay when I come back.' Which of these 3 do you think proved to be a neighbour to the man who fell among the robbers?" He said, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said to him, "You go and do likewise." So in this example, Jesus shows us who our neighbour is, who we should be loving. And that's the people we rub shoulders with in our day-to-day lives. The people we pass by who are in desperate need of help. Now, it's really important here in this story that the man is dying on the side of the road. He's not just poor or homeless, he's been robbed and beaten and dying on the side of the road. Now, I think that's really important to point out because people will extend this story and say, this is why we should be caring for the homeless that we walk past on the side of the street, for the poor that we walk past. And while I think that's a good thing to do, this passage and the story that Jesus tells isn't about the poor. Plenty of times in Jesus' ministry, he runs into the poor and the homeless, and we should be caring for them as we can. But this particular story, the man is dying on the side of the road. It's quite significant. Other people just walk by and don't bother, but the Samaritan does. Interestingly, in verse 33, the Samaritan has compassion. Just as Jesus has compassion on the crowds that follow him, when he sees the crowd, he has compassion on them because they're like sheep without a shepherd, and so he feeds them, he teaches them. He actually also feeds them as well. So the feeding of the 5,000. So while this passage shows that there's a radical love for those in desperate, desperate need, there is also a deeper spiritual meaning behind this, that while many others will walk past people who they think are just dead, God doesn't. So in the person of Jesus, as we're all spiritually dead, God provides for our deep, deep spiritual need. And so to be the neighbor of someone is to provide for their deep, deep need. If they're dying on the side of the road, help them. That is a very obvious need. But on top of that, there's also the deep spiritual need that people have. So, who is our neighbor? What's the people we rub shoulders with in our day-to-day life? Interestingly, the Greek word that's translated as neighbor here, plesion, it's used as a marker of closeness. So in John 4 verse 5, the same word, plesion, is used to describe Samaria as being a neighbor to a plot of ground which Jacob, an Old Testament character, gave to his son. And so plesion, it carries with it a sense of closeness, nearness. My neighbor is the person near me. So the word, it's describing that relationship of people we rub shoulders with. So who do we love? Who is our neighbor? The people we meet in our day-to-day life are our neighbors. Now this starts to segue into the next question about who's responsible to love who. But what I want to do is just summarize the things that we've seen so far. The first thing is that God's love toward us in Jesus. It's not anything lovable about us, but it's God's love toward us, despite our failure to love God. Then there's God's love that acts toward us to restore a relationship with him. That was the purpose of God's love. And so likewise, our love toward others wants to see a restored relationship with God. And it also doesn't expect to receive anything in return. Then we've also seen that primarily the command to love is within the community of Christians. So we've seen that in 1 John and in James. Yet, there is an extension of love to your neighbors. So those that you see your day-to-day life, rub shoulders with. And we'll see a bit more of this as we go through the Old Testament and look at foreigners and who the foreigner is. And we will see that you are to love the foreigner as well, but that's not without qualification. So let's get into that now. Who is the foreigner and who is responsible to love the foreigner? Well, to answer that question, we're going to do a sweep of the Old Testament. We're going to look through a bunch of passages. And now what we're going to need to do, though, is realize these are written for a theocracy, God's society, and he gives laws to build up this society so that it works well. And there is aspects of that we can draw out into our society now, even though it's not a theocracy. It's a democracy. Well, you hope it is anyway. But there are principles you can draw out. So for example, Exodus 22:20, it says, "Do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt." Now, that's spoken to Israel as they coming into the promised land. And then as Christians, you could rethink this passage in terms of the theological depth underpinning this, which is slavery in Egypt as a reflection of our slavery to sin, and that God saves us from our sin from that and brings us into a new land, a new life. So when we think about the command, don't mistreat a foreigner, that's very applicable to the Christian. Don't mistreat a foreigner because you know what it was to be a foreigner to God. May not know what it'd be to be a foreigner in Egypt, but we know what it was to be foreigners with God. If it wasn't for Jesus, I'd still be a foreigner to God, separated from him. Yeah, so you could reword this phrase as, do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were once foreigners to God. So what we see there is It was a command to God's people in the Old Testament, still applicable now, it just looks a little bit different. So what we're going to do is go through some Old Testament passages, look at the foreigners and Israelites and how these commands relate to them. So I'm not going to make too much comment on each one as I go, but it's just going to rail through and just see what we notice as we go. So here's the first one, Exodus 12:19. For 7 days no yeast to be found in your houses. And anyone, whether foreigner or native born, who eats anything with yeast in it must be cut off from the community of Israel. Exodus 12:48-49. A foreigner residing among you who wants to celebrate the Lord's Passover must have all the males in the household circumcised. Then he may take part like one born in the land. No circumcised male may eat it. The same law applies both to the native born and to the foreigner residing among you. Exodus 23:9. Do not oppress the foreigner. You yourselves know how it feels to be foreigners, because you are foreigners in Egypt. Leviticus 17:10. I will set my face against any Israelite or any foreigner residing among you who eats blood, and I will cut them off from the people. I will make a comment on this one. Jesus declares all foods clean in the New Testament when he says it's not what goes into a person that makes them unclean, but what comes out of their heart. So how you think about eating blood, and there are Christians who would say you probably shouldn't eat food with blood in it. I'm not one of those. I love eating meat. And yes, I think Jesus declares all foods clean in that statement that he makes in the New Testament. But anyway, moving on to the next one. Leviticus 18:26-27. But you must keep my decrees and my laws. The native born and the foreigners residing among you must not do any of these detestable things, for all these things were done by the people who lived in the land before you, and the land became defiled. Leviticus 19:33-34. When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Leviticus 20:2-3. Any Israelite or any foreigner residing in Israel who sacrifices any of his children to Moloch is to be put to death. The members of the community are to stone him. I myself will set my face against him and will cut him off from his people. For by sacrificing his children to Moloch, he has defiled my sanctuary and profaned my holy name. Leviticus 24:21-22. Whoever kills a human being is to be put to death. You are had the same law for the foreigner and the native born. I am the Lord your God. So that's just a small cross-section of a bunch of different passages, probably like 40 or 50 of them, that concern both Israelites and foreigners. What do you notice? So you might have noticed that the foreigner must live according to the law of the land which they reside in. So the Israelites have their laws, and the people who are foreigners are to live by those laws. And if they don't, they are kicked out of the land. They're cut off from the people. That's what it means. Exiled, removed. Other commands, when broken, led to the death penalty. But we also see that there were commands not to mistreat the foreigner as well that lives among them. So, for instance, if they wanted to participate in the Passover, they had to become circumcised and be part of the Israelite community and get rid of their old life. And they became part of Israel, probably almost no longer foreigners. It says, treated like a native born. They are to be treated like an Israelite. But they have to leave their old life behind, their old religion. Now, interestingly, it says that the foreigner doesn't have to be an Israelite to be in the land, but they can't sacrifice to Moloch. They can't have detestable practices. And so when we think about how these commands work and play themselves out in our modern day context, I think we can think about the principle of foreigners coming into a land and then living by its laws. So if we take these principles and apply them to a modern day context, particularly around the issue of immigration, we're really talking about the nature of immigration from Islamic countries into Western countries. And we need to ask, are they abiding by the law of the land? Are they bringing detestable practices with them into the land? They bring Sharia law. They don't want to obey the law of the land. Actually, they believe the laws of the land are set up by pagans and so they're ungodly and false. and so there's no need to obey the laws of the land. Then not to mention the detestable practices they bring with them. They believe that because of people's religious convictions, they should no longer cease to exist, that they should be dead. And we've seen that play out in Australia with the Bondi shooting. What we see is a religion that is not compatible with the law of the land. And it is perfectly fine and right for us to say, no, you cannot come into this country if you abide by these practices. Not to mention Islam's horrible treatment of women. They make them dress head to toe in everything and cover all pieces of skin because of their own failure to control themselves. Now, I'll give them this. Western women could wear a lot more clothing and practice modesty, but we aren't going to kill them or beat them half to death because of it. And then, mentioning beating, they beat their own wives. If they don't leave bruises on them, it's fine. There's so much more wrong with Islam that we could go into, but it's just horrible practices they bring with them, and they don't give them up when they come here. We don't make them give up these practices when they come into the country. And so why on earth do we think that they're going to be living in line with the laws of the land when we don't make them? So God was setting up a civil society for God's people, and if foreigners were coming to reside among them, they had to live by the laws of the land, even some of the religious practices. Particularly if they were detestable, they came with punishments. And then in some horrible cases in America, you see foreigners being treated with partial judgment. And so you have them coming and committing horrible, violent crimes, rapes and murders, and them getting 6 months good behaviour bonds and going out and doing it all again. I was like, where's the justice in that? If you're a native born and you committed those crimes, you'd be spending the rest of your life in jail. And so we have this partiality in judgment that we saw in those passages. They are to be treated the same. The foreigner is treated the exact same as the native born. Anyway, that's a mild rant of mine. But when we talk about the obligation to love the foreigner, do we love them at any cost? I think we see that it's possible, and there are commands to love the foreigner. But what if that comes at the cost of loving my neighbor? What if that comes at the cost of loving my family, loving God? And so those people I rub shoulders with, the foreigner, when they come and live and reside among me, become my neighbor in a sense. And so I love them. But what about the foreigners I never rub shoulders with? How responsible am I for loving them? And so what I've gone through in these passages hopefully shown us that there's responsibility to love people in the Christian community, to love people you rub shoulders with, to love foreigners who reside among you, who in a sense become your neighbor. But the idea of loving people who are genuine foreigners to you, you don't know them at all, you're going to be hard-pressed to find commands to love them in the Bible. Now, we love all people because they're made in the image of God. That's true. But does that mean I need to go out of my way to extend love to the people I can't see? So the way I've gone about thinking through how this works and how do I love, when should I love people in certain categories of those people in my life, I've thought about it as concentric circles. It's how I've kind of explained it to mates and stuff before. This is what I've got here. In the middle is God. And what I mean here is your relationship with God. Now, if you're not watching or you listen on Spotify or whatever and you don't have the visual, I'll try and explain it. If you don't know what concentric circles are, it's circles within each other, kind of like a target when you go shooting arrows or target shooting with a gun. But in the middle, you've got God. Every person is responsible for their relationship with God and loving God, first and foremost. Then just out of that, I've put spouse. Now, for some people, that's not applicable because you don't have a spouse, but I thought it was important to put there because your spouse and you become one flesh. And so, in a sense, loving them is part of your love for God, is loving your spouse. So working on your relationship with God, in one sense, is working on your love for your spouse. Now, you could conceive of situations where you might forsake loving God to love your spouse, but that would be wrong. So let's say your regular Bible reading with God, to sit and listen to your Heavenly Father speak to you, let's say you decided to put that to the side to wash the dishes for your spouse. Now, if you started a regular pattern of doing that, instead of working on your relationship with God and listening to your Heavenly Father speak to you and grow you, you're washing dishes. Sure, your spouse might feel loved by that, but in reality, you're failing to love God. You're failing to grow. And because of the nature of the relationship between a husband and wife, if you're growing in a relationship with God, you are loving your spouse. So it's very closely tied, these two. But I thought it was worth putting there because there'd be many ways you could misconstrue love for your spouse and fail to love God. Now, the next one I've got is family. So a passage I've read out before on other episodes, but I'll read it out again, is 1 Timothy 5:8 that says, "But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." And so here it's just showing just how important it is to provide for and care for those in your family, particularly those in your household. And so to forget to care for your children, or forget to care for your spouse, that's horrible. Worse than an unbeliever, it says. And so to forsake loving them to love other believers would be wrong. And so this is where we start to see how this concentric circle starts to work. In the middle, we've got God. Just outside that, your spouse. Just outside that, your family. And then believers, other Christians, those in your church, your community. Now, to forsake loving ones on the inside of this concentric circle, to love ones on the outside, is getting the order of priorities wrong of who you should be loving. So, for instance, if, let's say, someone at church needed meals cooked for them for the next couple weeks, and so I go and cook meals for them for the next couple weeks because they've just had a kid or something, how loving is that? That's awesome. And I know people do that pretty regularly for couples who have kids. But in doing so, I didn't feed my kids for 2 weeks. While I've shown love to other believers, I've failed to love my own children. Now, you could say that was self-sacrificial and sacrificing for your kids, but there's a level of sacrifice and teaching people to learn to sacrifice in their life for God, which is a good thing. But there's also going beyond that and failing to provide. Now, in that example, I think that'd be a level of failing to provide for your family. In order to love someone else, you need to get the order of priorities right in this, in the way I've structured this. And so if you fail to do one on the inside, it starts to crumble down. Particularly when you fail to love God, it all falls apart. You see that in our society. But anyway, so that's the next layer out, believers. For those who can't see, in the middle we've got God, spouse, family, believers. That's the order so far. Next one out from that is neighbors. So we've seen that in a few passages, that these are the people I rub shoulders with, and they're not other believers. So the Samaritan who walks past a person on the side of the road who's in desperate need, they're dying, providing for their needs, just loving those people around me. Now, to provide for the needs of those around me, but forsaking my family or other believers would be totally wrong. So, for instance, if there's people within need in our church and we don't provide for their needs, but we provide for the needs of our neighbors, but you could even put in there friends. So your friends who aren't Christians fall into the category of neighbors, not believers. And I think this is a bit of a rebuke to us at times when we might treat our close friends who aren't Christians as believers and not as neighbors. And we'll treat believers like they're neighbors and not believers. We actually are commanded to love other Christians sacrificially and provide for them. And if you're doing that for your friends but not doing that for people in your own church, you're getting these orders wrong. And that's not pleasing to God. Now, the last one out, and this is where we get to the touch point about this situation of immigration, is foreigners. Now, like I've said, the foreigner who comes and resides among you, they become like your neighbor. So when I say foreigner here in this diagram, they aren't the people who live among you who you rub shoulders with. They are genuinely foreigners. You don't know them at all. You don't rub shoulders with them. You don't see them, nothing. Now, if I was to extend a hand of love to people I do not know at all, and in doing so, I fail to provide for my spouse, I fail to provide for my family, I fail to provide for believers or neighbors in providing love to a foreigner, I've completely mixed up the order of responsibilities to love here. So Augustine, famous church father, talks about ordered loves. Ordered loves. And so God obviously being the priority of our love and moving out from that and loving others. And so I think if we extend a hand to foreigners, people we never ever meet, we never rub shoulders with, and fail to show love towards other people much closer that we do, we've misordered our love towards others. Now, if we have the opportunity to love a foreigner while also loving neighbors, believers, family, and spouse, and God, we should. We should aim to do good to all people. That's a good thing to do. For example, I've got a sponsored child in Africa at the moment. Never met him. I know him. Interesting though, he is a Christian. He attends church, so you could put him in the category of believer though. So that's a little bit different, but nonetheless, I haven't met him, but I extend a hand of love towards them. But this is where it becomes a little bit trickier, is we go, okay, so if that's me as a Christian in my life and spheres of life that I'm in, what about as a nation? So this becomes trickier because we're not a theocracy. Majority of our politicians aren't Christians. How do they think about how to love foreigners? So for the politician who isn't a Christian, they're not thinking about loving God or believers. They probably are thinking about how to love their family and their spouse. And interestingly, I think if you asked many of the politicians, they wouldn't forsake loving their spouse and loving their family in order to love foreigners. They would love their spouse and their family first before they loved foreigners. But the question I want to put to the way Australia is governed is, do we love our neighbours before we're loving foreigners? The people we rub shoulders with, Australians. In that I think there's a good argument to make that there is a structure, an order, of priorities of love that you need to love your neighbours before you're loving foreigners. Now, I think there's a helpful critique here in that, well, we live in a broken world. We're never going to perfectly love our neighbours well. And so if we live that out, we'll never extend a hand of love to foreigners ever. Because we wouldn't say at some arbitrary point, oh, we're perfectly loving our neighbours now. Okay, now I can extend a hand to foreigners. I understand that critique and that's helpful. But when the majority of our society is struggling with cost of living, we're asking questions already about, hey, are we importing too many people into Australia? Like, are we getting way too many people in here? If that is the topic of conversation generally in our society, I think it's starting to put up red flags for people and going, hey, I think maybe we are overkilling this. Like, we're doing it too much. And so what we're starting to see, and I think this is true, is the consequence of this misordered love in our society, particularly in our politicians' policies that they've made. in that we're seeing a misordering of their loves, and they've put foreigners closer to the centre than neighbours, Australians, and in doing so, it's starting to cause problems, unsurprisingly. When you put your loves in the wrong order, I'm not surprised that things start to fall apart. And so the argument I'm making here is that there is a right order of people to love. At some point, you need to be doing a genuine good job of loving neighbours before extending a hand to the foreigner. And I think in our current climate, we are, as a nation, failing to love neighbours well. We're failing to love the people we rub shoulders with. We're failing to love Australians well by extending a hand to foreigners that we shouldn't be extending as much. Now, I'm not entirely anti-immigration, as I think we've seen throughout here, that if you order your loves properly, you should indeed extend a hand of love to the foreigner, 100%. But if you're failing to love people within this concentric circle in order to do that, you're misordering your love. And that's not good. So that is my argument for why Christians should be considering whether immigration is a good thing or not. My personal opinion is that we should be reducing or stopping it until we can actually love our neighbours well, love Australians well as a society, and then start offering a larger hand to foreigners again. But at the current climate, in the way things are in Australia, I just don't think that's the case at the moment. We shouldn't be extending such a large hand of love to the foreigners when we are significantly failing on the front of loving neighbours. That's my opinion. Now, as Christians, I think this is not a topic to divide over. It's not a topic that you should be causing fights and quarrels amongst Christians. It is incredibly important to think through, and people have significant questions for Christians on this topic, and they'll bring up Bible passages about loving foreigners and this and that. I just want us to have a bit more of a robust answer and ethical thought about what is appropriate ways to love different people in our spheres of life. And by having more robust and helpful conversation in this, that Christians will be built up through this process. Now, you may still land on the no, immigration, open immigration, it's fine, it's good. If you land there, that's fine. I understand. You're still my brother or sister in Christ. It is not something to divide over and cause a muck. It's not like it's the topic of abortion, for instance, where that's just an abhorrent disregard for human life and it's an evil practice, and that if you're a Christian, you support that. I would question whether you're a Christian. Plain and simple. It is not something you support. Like Israel supporting the sacrificing of the children of Molech to Molech. That was grounds for being killed, cut off from the people of Israel. And I don't see why it's not grounds for being cut off from the Christian community either. That is a significant topic. But this topic of immigration is not one of those. So hopefully you found this helpful. Maybe it sparks questions and it'll spark conversation. This definitely wasn't the most thorough explanation that could be out there, but I think it's a good starting point. And maybe this will lead into a possible another episode down the track that digs into some other topics that particularly bounce off from this. So maybe that idea of ordered loves, how does that work? Loving people well, that could be a good topic. But anyway, hopefully you can have some great discussion around this topic with others. Let me know how that goes. Let me know if you have any other thoughts on the topic or things I've missed. There definitely would have been things I've missed. But until next time, I'll catch you on the next episode of God and Man.